about the technology today. We're on the Zoom platform, and we've already asked you, for those of you who are coming in, we have instructions coming into the chat to introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, your organization, where you're coming from, and one word that comes to your mind when you think about community ownership and stewardship. So as you all introduce yourselves in the chat, I want to make sure that you know that you can ask questions throughout the session through the chat. And we will be having small breakout groups a little bit later in this session. If that's something that you want to opt out of, you're welcome to do so by staying in the main room. And we'll have a Jamboard, a Google Jamboard that you can interact with. And you don't necessarily have to engage in a breakout group, although we surmise that many of you would like to share some of the work that you've been doing. What I'd like to do now is introduce Rabia Sen of Esperanza Community Housing Corporation to welcome us into this space and create a land acknowledgement for us. So Rabia, if you could, please.
Yes, welcome everyone. I wanted to first start off by saying that, land acknowledgements, as you know, are so important. We're honoring the land, we're honoring the history of people who have come before us, who are still among us. And we are also a part of that. And I also just want to acknowledge that whatever we say in the way of a land acknowledgement, we recognize that it may not touch on everything, and we hope that you will understand that as well. And we apologize if we've left anyone out with this. You will see on your screen an excerpt from a poem by Fadwa Tukan, a Palestinian poet. And it's an excerpt from her poem, Hamza, and we can put a link to the full poem in the chat because that certainly provides a lot more context for this. But this particular excerpt, I will just read it. My sister, our land has a throbbing heart. It doesn't cease to beat, and it endures the unendurable. It keeps the secrets of hills and wombs. This land, sprouting with spikes and palms, is also the land that gives birth to a freedom fighter. This land, my sister, is a woman. I'm just going to give folks a few moments just to take this in. Thanks. Maggie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Rabia. I hope you are all in a place where you can find your feet on the ground at some point this day. Just so you all know, we wanted to provide you a structure for today's gathering. Today we're right in the middle of our opening. We're going to then move into who we are hosting this session. We'll talk about the purpose of our panel series, of which this is the first, and it's really focused in on community ownership and stewardship. We'll then get into the history and the context of what has us here today, where there are many, many entities across this country pursuing community ownership and stewardship projects and pursuits. We'll have a panel discussion with two incredible partners to talk about what they've been up to in their various parts of the country. And then we'll break out into groups so that you all can discuss the past, what has brought you to this place, what you're grappling with now, and what you hope to pursue in the future. After that, we hope you'll stay because we have a really cool new resource for you that we will launch today for all of you who are here. It's pretty incredible, and we really want to share it with you all. And then we'll close out with you with a brief closing exercise. Um, and so that's how we'll spend the next hour and a half together. So who are we? You're probably wondering. This series This is a series of events. It's an initiative of the National Equitable Recovery Alliance, otherwise known as NARA. It's a collective of social entrepreneurs based in 6 communities throughout the US. Our vision is a future of anti-racist community development guided by local relationships, equity champions, all nurturing a new generation of anti-racist community developers. Today, you are hearing from the Community Ownership and Stewardship Impact Table within NARA. Of that, we have the Center for Community Wealth Building, and my partner Paul is here representing them. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I work at the Center for Community Wealth Building as the Co-op Development Co-Director. Super excited to be here.
Thanks, Paul. We also have Esperanza Community Housing Corporation. Rabia, would you like to introduce yourself again as representative of this?
Yes. Hi again, everyone. Rabia Sen, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of Policy with Esperanza Community Housing that's located here in South Central Los Angeles.
And we also have Inclusive Action for the City sitting at this table. And I have my friends Chiwe and Osman here. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, folks. My name is Osman Ahmed. I'm acting as a Zoom tech for you all today, so I'll be in the chat mostly in the background, and I'll pass it to Chiwe.
Hey everyone, sharing space with y'all.
Thanks, everyone. And then we have Neighborhood Development Collaborative, where I'm the program director. Neighborhood Development Collaborative is a coalition of 20 plus Metro Denver-based nonprofits who are building homes for middle and low income residents, strengthening neighborhoods with community-oriented businesses, and really providing innovative human services. So that is your table, your impact table. We come from Denver and LA. And we've been working on understanding what community ownership and stewardship really is. And we're coming to you today with the first in our series. So, as we mentioned, there is a series of webinars, and we really actually want to do our last one in person. That's to be determined on where, but it might be Denver. The series that we are coming to you with is really something that we've been thinking about for a while. Many community organizations have adopted community ownership strategies to acquire and steward community real estate for community benefit in order to prevent displacement, preserve affordability, and increase access to wealth building opportunities. We are inspired by the actions of many groups throughout the US, and at the same time, we feel the need to pause and ask, where are we collectively headed? How can we ensure that our collective efforts are not merely harm reduction, but something truly transformative? Recognizing that real estate systems set in motion long ago have been driven by extraction and racist practices, we want to ask, what futures are we collectively setting in motion? And so today you'll see that we're talking about community ownership and stewardship, we're defining it, and we're talking about how it's already in motion today in many pockets of the country. In May, we'll talk about the intersections with racial equity and environmental justice and how important all 3 legs of those stools are with community ownership. The third session is really connecting resources to community ownership and stewardship projects. This is hard work, and the systems that we have set up today are not necessarily enabling for this type of work. So we're finding ways to work within the current system, and we're treading new pathways. We want to lift those up for you. Lastly, in November, we'd love to have this one in person. And we really want to be thinking, we're future oriented here. We really want to be thinking about what's next in community ownership and stewardship. And then we'll see what's next. So for today's session, the purpose really is to define the history of community ownership in the US and to discuss links between ownership and other movements of racial and economic justice, unearth questions that have driven low-income communities of color to develop their own strategies, both addressing racist barriers and systems, and also establishing practices that begin to heal the relationships that we have with home and land. And lastly, we want to share emerging learnings from nonprofits and community groups who are stewarding real estate for community ownership. So that's what our session is today. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Chi-Wei and Osman to kick us off, to give us a little bit of background of how we've gotten to today and where we're headed.
Thanks, Maggie. So I would like to share a little story of the land that we're on together. I think it starts, we have to acknowledge the relationship with the land, started with the respect and harmony with the indigenous people on this land. But since the initial contact, the relationship between people and land, largely the newcomers, the land became driven by economic motives, and it started the commodification of land during the colonial period, then its weaponization during its westward expansion, inflicting violence on the indigenous people. So let's start with pre-colonial period, where land is largely communally owned. And the indigenous land stewardship practice treated land as sacred, relative. That is, one is not separate from nature and land. In a lot of languages, that nature is not a separate word, it's just part of who they are. And land is not a commodity to be sold based on this belief and practice. Then comes the colonial period. The European colonists established settlements through treaties, purchases, coercion, violence. I think treaty is a very kind word to use. But for example, in 1626, when the Lenape people, the true native New Yorkers, sold the land, what they really meant was they're sharing the right to use the land. But then it ties back to the belief, again, land is not a commodity. And when you have a treaty that's about a concept that does not exist to a culture, it's inherently unfair. And just like that, and the Lenape and other Native American groups often feel like they were deceived or coerced into signing away their land rights. And that really started the private land ownership on this land that we are on together. And the commodification of the land became even more entrenched as enterprises started sprouting up, needing to extract more resources to accumulate wealth. Then fast forward to the westward expansion. That's when the discovery doctrine came in. It was established in the first of the Marshall Trilogy in 1823, where European nations can claim and control the lands they discovered when indigenous people have lived and cared for that land for thousands of years. And again, oftentimes this is through violence to claim this control of the land. And that fed into the Manifest Destiny, a mixture of ideological, economic, and nationalistic factors that believe that the expansion of the U.S. was, divinely ordained, justifiable, and inevitable. And personally, I think the main reason was, again, the economic opportunities that the West promised, the promise of the possibilities of settlements, agriculture, and resource extraction for people that ventured westward. And in the 19th century, we started seeing treaties like the Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, where the U.S. territory significantly expanded. And again, that was intrinsically tied to the Manifest Destiny. And under that, treaties like that, a lot of times property and land rights, for example, of the Mexican people that live already in California and New Mexico and the southwest corner of the current United States, and the indigenous people's land rights were supposed to be protected, but that was often disregarded by the U.S. government. And And once we got this new huge territory, we need to build a railroad to connect everyone to keep on expanding. So the 1860s, there were the railroad land grant that further encroached the tribal lands. And I think none were more significant than 1887's Dawes Act, where it essentially outlawed the communal ownership of Native American land, divided up the reservations to small parcels to be owned by individual Native Americans. And this really greatly reduced the tribal land sovereignty, and any surplus land is opened up for sale for non-native settlers. And as a result of that, the tribes lost about 90 million acres of treaty land, or about 2/3 of the land base, and about 90,000 Native Americans were made landless. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And I think this is where the story of the land take another turn again. It's became one about racialization and weaponization of land. Through policies is to make sure that value generated by land is captured by white Americans, and then the financialization, it goes beyond the commodification that we previously saw to extract resources directly. Now it became a financial instrument for the wealthy to accumulate more wealth and further decoupling land from social and cultural and spiritual connection. So it started, let's look into early mid 20th century. The practices like racially restrictive covenants, they enforced the racial segregation in housing, prohibited the sale, the lease, and rental of the properties to Black Americans and other non-white groups. And around the same time, you also have laws like alien land laws in many Western states that prohibit Asian immigrants, largely targeting Chinese and Japanese immigrants to own land. That's also the same time we have federal housing policy that developed things like homeowner loan corporation MEPs that started the red line communities where they are unable to secure loans, which perpetuated racial segregation to add salt to injuries. Is that saying? The Federal Housing Administration, the underwriting manual that's racially biased, further endorsed the racially restrictive covenant, and it undervalues the properties in the community of colors and lower income communities. And then the last punch of the Cumble, there is the freeway construction that really followed the same rhetorics by the redlining and the underwriting manual. That's with the idea that communities of colors are slums to be cleared, and thus the land values in that communities were already systemically depressed, and making it cheaper to run the highway through it. And I'll be remiss to not mention an example here in Los Angeles. We have two neighborhoods, Boyle Heights, largely Latino then, and Beverly Hills, both protest against freeway plans. One neighborhood was able to get a freeway rerouted, while the other had 4 freeways driven through it. And then the one with 4 freeways driven through it is Boyle Heights. And that brings us to sort of the contemporary situation we're in. In the 70s and the 80s, we had the financial deregulations, created the practice of shadow banking, speculation, risky lending practices for the benefit of investors and shareholders. And that started the systemic financialization of real estate with mortgage-based securities, collateralized debt obligation, when you bundle a bunch of debts together, resell that, and the expansion of the real estate investment trust, the REITs. And that all culminated in the 2008 financial crisis, where 17 trillion wealth was lost, 8 million homes were foreclosed, and most of those, or a lot of those, were in lower income communities of color, where the subprime mortgage targeted. And so that's really the sort of what pushed us. We wanted to talk about this more, and the work that we're doing together is to shift the story of land to one about communalization and rematriation, the now and the future, about community ownership and stewardship. And with that, I'll sort of pass back to the panelists to really get into the discussion today and a discussion with you all. And thank you for letting me share this story with you all.
Thank you, Chiwei. And I'm excited to introduce our 2 panelists, Rabia Sen and Jessica Ulguin. Rabia Sen is Director of Policy at Esperanza Community Housing Corporation, which is an organization that works on issues related to affordable housing, equitable development, and anti-displacement strategies, environmental justice, health access, racial justice, immigrants' rights, and much more. Rabia has worked in the social justice movement for over 20 years, addressing the complexity of experiences that shape the lives of individuals, families, and communities. And prior to joining Esperanza, Rabia worked in related fields addressing the confluence of structural violence and social justice issues, especially their impact on survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence. Jessica Citlali-Olguin is the Executive Director of Center for Community Wealth Building, where I work. She is my colega and jefa, a veces. It's an organization that empowers communities, creates and maintains dignified jobs in locally grounded businesses, and reshapes and strengthens the framework of inclusivity. She was appointed by Governor Polis to serve on the Colorado Employee Ownership Commission and the state's Transportation Commission. She also serves on the board of the Non-Attainment Area Air Pollution Mitigation Enterprise and the Bridge and Tunnel Enterprise. She grew up in the Swansea neighborhood in Denver and has done grassroots community organizing with immigrant groups and low-income communities across Denver Metro since 2000. She has dedicated her life to empowering disenfranchised communities to break the cycle of poverty through education and entrepreneurship. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited just to jump in here and to talk more about community ownership with you. So we have 3 questions and we're going to open it up to the group after that. But one of the first questions is, to address the impacts of rising rents and real estate prices, many community benefiting organizations have taken steps toward acquiring and stewarding local real estate. They've used this to prevent displacement, to retain affordability, and to increase access to wealth building. Can you describe how your organization defines community ownership and stewardship and how you are pursuing it? Can we start with you, Rabia?
Yeah, sure. Esperanza Community Housing, we are both a provider of affordable housing. We have 9 buildings here in South Central. And we are also an environmental justice organization. Access to healthy, affordable housing is a part and parcel of principles of equitable development. And just a shout out to our Unidad Coalition colleagues here, past and present, who worked over 10 years with the community to develop a lot of these principles of equitable development that we believe in. And central to all of that is always centering those most impacted by the inequities that we see, because those are the voices that need to lead. We don't organize the community. We organize with and alongside the community, and we all need to come with the humility that we're just one part of the whole. With this, with honoring the community, it also means honoring the history that has brought us here, including that of the land. So it means looking at the long history of racist planning and zoning policies that have dictated land use, who gets to live where and how, and that has allowed the free trade of the sacred earth and people's lives on the market. So when we look at the idea of community ownership and stewardship, we ask, what does it mean when we say we own the land? Whose land is it? And how intentional are we in ensuring that we're not giving in to dominant capitalist paradigms by viewing it solely as a commodity or something off which to profit? So that's why when we look at community stewardship, we're looking to address the intersection of both housing justice and environmental justice. And we have so many of our colleagues here from both the Actile and Unidad coalitions today, whom we really value and with whom we really work to figure out, what does this intersection look like? How can we do both? Here in LA, Esperanza Community Housing, with the help of this grant, is convening a small group of folks, BIPOC-led grassroots housing justice and EJ orgs, to identify strategies of community stewardship. And just a shout out to Takao Suzuki from Little Tokyo Service Center and Jessica Melendez from Trust South LA, who are part of this working group. And part of that is that this group has developed a working definition of community stewardship that I think will be shared on screen shortly, but I will read it off as well. Community ownership and stewardship and control are both about economic justice, central to which are collective economics and self-determination, which ensure residents have control over their own community and that they share in all its work and wealth. Traditional forms of land ownership and ownership of resources, particularly here in the US, have been based on a settler colonial mentality that has extracted value from people in the land for personal profit and is based on the oppression of some communities for the benefit of others. Therefore, we propose this idea of community control of assets as a strategy toward healing and justice by shifting towards a living and regenerative economy. Therefore, we create community control of assets and resources through community decision-making, uplifting a model of public control over public resources for public good. And therefore, the outcome of this strategy is going to be one of community stewardship. It's the practice of engaging in community-led strategies that uplift regenerative economic practices to honor and support the empowerment of people, as well as our relationship with the land, both as stewards and as partners. It's done through community envisioned and community-led strategies that, while acknowledging the genocide and extractive practices that have created harm, it heals both the land and communities impacted by systemic violence, as well as heals the relationship between the people and the land themselves. So let's stop there.
Thank you for sharing that. So I know there's a lot of juicy things that we could also respond to, but I want to just go back to Jessica and just ask the same question. So please, can you describe how your organization defines community ownership and stewardship and how you are pursuing it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And all of the above that's been said, check, done. One of the things that we focus at Center for Community Wealth Building is focusing on the vision. We envision self-determined communities free from racism and rooted in economic democracy, dignity, and joy. Since the beginning, we have been focused on ensuring that the racist policies of this country can actually be undone. And we know that the time we have been under all of these racist policies for a very long time, and so it's going to take time to do it. So we define community stewardship and ownership based on the community voices. I was very privileged to have the honor of connecting with almost 400 community members and individuals who would talk to me about what it would take to actually build an economy that works for all, not just the wealthy and well-connected, but for everyone. And so we see community ownership and stewardship as a collective control and collective responsibility that a community has over the resources, the assets, and the decision-making process that in essence is embedded in their lives. Our approach is to emphasize the active participation of community members in shaping and really managing the economic, social, and cultural aspects of our communities. And so we take this through the community wealth building framework, which in essence, we're working alongside communities. We are here to connect to resources, to truly look at how we revitalize our local economies. We focus on the creation and retention of wealth within our communities, which includes promoting our work to strengthen our local businesses. We support the incubation of worker cooperatives. We truly believe that we own not just the land, but that we own our jobs as part of our destiny. And we encourage place-based institutions such as hospitals, universities, and municipalities to leverage their economic engine to support our local economy. And so as part of the conversation that I had early on with community members, we recognized that there was so much power in employee ownership and those cooperative business models to ensure that that wealth can stay in our communities. And this is part of that community ownership piece. As part of our work with small businesses, we had a focus group to try to better understand what could help them. And pretty early on, we recognized that without owning the land or without having control over the land, the businesses, they could do everything possible and yet still be at the mercy of the landlords. And so eventually we recognized that we needed to be more proactive in our approach because we could provide a lot of the support that businesses need. And yet the moment that landlords say, your lease is not going to be renewed, they would be out the door and having to start all over again. And so we think about community ownership as asset building. We focus on promoting the community ownership of assets such as the commercial space, because we recognize that when people can own the land or be stewards of the land, that they can actually create long-term sustainability for themselves, for their families, and for their communities. When we think about small business and the impact that they have in our communities, they're truly what makes us unique. They are the fabric and the cultural connection in our communities. And so the thought of losing businesses goes beyond just losing the business or losing the job, but it really is losing that connection to the cultural connection in our communities, especially in a time when our neighborhoods are being gentrified, our histories are being erased, intentionally or unintentionally. And so I truly see this community ownership and stewardship as a critical component to making sure that we can actually continue to be in place and giving opportunity for our communities to be in place. And all of this comes with participatory decision making. We truly believe that our communities should be at the core of the decisions that are being made every day. And we know that for that to happen, we have to focus on capacity building. We know that education, skill training, and leadership development are really at the core of community ownership and stewardship. So I will leave it at that. I'm very passionate about this. I can talk about this all day, but in the interest of time, I will leave it there.
Thank you both. So community ownership represents a paradigm shift from traditional, often exploitative systems. It challenges existing power structures and promotes more equitable and just ways of managing our resources, both environmental and man-made resources. In the face of the challenges that come with navigating the existing power structure, what challenges have you come up against in pursuing your version of community ownership and stewardship? Oh, and I'm also seeing there's a question just in the chat that says, can you describe how you define your communities and who is included when you discuss community ownership? So that might also be clarifying.
Should I go ahead, Paul? Okay. Just a quick thing on how we define our communities. As Esperanza, we work alongside the communities in South Central LA. So it's the residents there. And as an environmental justice organization, we often talk about this community, as unfortunately so many are in Los Angeles, being frontline communities. So they are dealing not just with housing injustice, but they're also dealing with environmental racism. So I know that's a very general view of how we define our communities, but just wanted to throw that out there for now. Paul, in terms of the question you just asked and challenges, they are multifold. And it all comes from a dominant paradigm that still sees housing and land as a commodity, which leads to false solutions. So, for example, on the environmental justice side, often what we're seeing is people looking at mitigation and the appeasement of toxic industries, especially the fossil fuel industry, through the use of policies such as cap and trade policies that basically seem to say, it's okay, you pollute, as long as you pay us something and you don't do it here. And the result of cap and trade policies, research has actually shown that it has resulted in increasing the concentration of polluting industries in frontline communities. So that's one thing, right? Another thing with environmental justice is, I'm sure you've all seen this, it's a really wonderful marketing ploy, apparently, where companies talk about their carbon footprint. And it seems they talk about it as a way to say they're sorry, and that saying sorry is enough for them to continue their practices, to justify it, and continue contaminating the land and creating environmental racism. So that's some of the ways it is showing up, right? In the housing justice space, we are seeing the increasing dominance of YIMBY narratives that tell us that the way to solve the housing and homelessness crisis is to simply build, 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 and that state regulations, around tenant protections, community engagement, and key environmental protections are actually the problem. And it's creating a division or trying to create a division among housing justice and EJ advocates. But as long as we can continue working together, that's something that we can counter. Because we know that all of this, it's an incomplete analysis of the problem, because it's not simply a lack of supply, right? It's a crisis that's been created over time, right? It's a crisis of supply, but a lack of supply of healthy and affordable housing at the deepest affordability levels. It's a lack of access to that. It's a lack of true, deep community engagement and visioning to ensure that any money coming in and any developments are done in a way that is equitable and that prevent gentrification and displacement. It's a lack of that analysis of how this long history of racist planning and zoning policies have created the crisis, because the same forces that created the crisis of housing affordability, right, the gentrification, displacement, redlining practices, banks, their financing, and predatory lending practices. These same forces are, in fact, the same ones who have simultaneously created the crisis of environmental racism. Because the same policies that dictated who could live where are the same policies that also dictated where toxic industrial land uses could dominate and whom their practices could poison and sicken. And that's why in South Central and in other frontline communities in LA, such as Wilmington, we see how the fossil fuel industry has poisoned and devastated them, while the same system, including the banks that have supported and continue to support the fossil fuel industry, have also allowed market forces to commodify housing and drive people out of their homes. These two crises are not separate. They are linked. And that is the challenge we face. We need to stand firm that there is no excuse to designate some communities as sacrifice zones simply for the benefit of a few. And we need to be clear that when we talk of those who have been impacted by predatory, extractive, and toxic industrial practices and the systems that enable them, we're talking about an issue of racial justice and Indigenous rights. A willful ignorance of the stark truth that communities most impacted by such systemic inequities are low-income communities of color whose lives, health, and well-being, they have been devalued in this country, a country that also is part of an entire world that is still, unfortunately, shaped by current and historic forces of imperialism, of settler colonialism, the genocide of Indigenous people, and anti-Black racism. It is a cynical system with a cynical ploy that tries to continually pit people against one another simply to consolidate their own power and fortunes. So again, our challenge is to reject these divisions that are being sown, quite frankly, by racist, capitalist market forces who want to stop us from centering community voices and experience, because we've seen the victories that happen when we can do that. And we know that doing so will lead to that paradigm shift where housing is seen as a human right and environmental justice is seen as a part and parcel of that. That's why we look at strategies such as community stewardship as a way to also address this intersection. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, it almost seems overly simple to say it, but it's almost like you're making visible what capitalism tries to make invisible just by, engaging with people and allowing them to have decision-making power over land and resources. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on this question? What challenges that you've come up against in pursuing your vision of community ownership and stewardship?
Absolutely. And I also want to go back to the community definition because we get asked this all the time. For Center for Community Wealth Building, we do focus on Metro Denver. We focus people of color, people who have been disenfranchised from our systems, low-income communities, in neighborhoods that have faced redlining and are now facing gentrification. And so these have been typically disinvested neighborhoods, which is one of the where I grew up, and now receiving a lot of investment without the consideration of how to preserve the communities that have been there for generations. And so now when we talk about challenges, there's so many. Again, I don't know how I can bring everything into 4 minutes, but I will try. But I think if I can narrow it down, the biggest barrier that we're dealing with is the fact that shared prosperity is not the American dream. We are sold this individualistic dream that you get ahead and you do whatever you need to do so that you can get to where you want to be. When in reality, we know that there isn't a single person, there isn't a single, even if you think about business, that have been able to do it by themselves. Even the most successful businesses have relied on the community infrastructure to be able to make it happen. And so this fallacy that it's all about you and your own bootstraps is truly, it's a flawed system. When we think about some of the challenges that come alongside that, has really been access to readily available capital and affordable capital, non-extractive capital, because we know that our communities haven't necessarily had the opportunity to acquire land or to acquire truly any type of ownership. And so it is going to take a significant level of investment to make sure that we can actually mobilize opportunity. Even when we think about commercial real estate, which we're really passionate about, and we know that can be a significant leverage. I was working with a group of business owners, and right alongside of the highway. And at that time, our Department of Transportation was looking to expand the highway. This impacted businesses on the north and south side of the highway. Businesses on the south side of the highway, predominantly immigrant, Latino-owned, Spanish-speaking, and they didn't necessarily receive the support that was needed. Not only did they not receive the support, but they started getting letters from the landlord saying, well, there's going to be people coming to see the place. Not once were they given the opportunity to purchase. And so when we think about that challenge, and in fact, the landlord kept saying, we're not selling, don't worry about it, but sign this document where we're not selling. And all of a sudden, December comes and he says, oh, and by the way, this is your new landlord. Without even having the opportunity for these community members, business owners to come together, even though collectively they paid more than what the mortgage payment would have been or the payment would have been for that property. And so not even having the opportunity, and so not having the policies in place to give people the right of first refusal has been a significant barrier. As we know, profit motives are being prioritized over people's needs. And so this is a significant issue in our city. And when we think about the incentives that our economic development entities are providing, they're not necessarily extending those to our communities. And so if we take it a step further and think about the challenges, I go back to our political structure. When we think about Citizens United and the role that corporations and for-profit entities have played in ultimately having a say in who is making these decisions at our local level, that has significant implications for our communities. And so the last thing that I'll mention is that one of the biggest barriers that we have is this notion that business is separate than our communities. When our institutions, when our governments are making decisions, let's take RFPs, for example. There's an RFP for a service needed in our city. They typically look at best value or lowest bid, without the realization that lowest bid comes at the expense of our workers, that comes at the expense of our people in our communities. And so these requests for proposals are being evaluated based on to what extent we can extract, without the consideration that the total cost of this is actually much higher, because we as taxpayers are having to figure out how to ensure that the safety net is there, so that when these corporations extract the profit from the communities, that our communities can still be in a place where they can thrive. And so not connecting that has a significant impact in our communities, and is ultimately having an impact on how our communities can own.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So there was a question in the chat that someone looked it up. They wanted to just understand a little bit more about how do your organizations engage with Native peoples and community ownership? Are they a part of your community?
Um, so our engagement with Native peoples in our coalition spaces is where we really try and be intentional about who is in that space and who needs to be there. And in a lot of the environmental justice coalitions that we are a part of, we actually try to do that. I know some of our colleagues are here today as well. I think the other piece is being cognizant and therefore trying to be very intentional about how we're using resources. And by resources in this, I'm talking about funding from mainstream funders. The eligibility guidelines for who can get funding, the guidelines on evaluation and all of that tend to actually weed out and exclude small BIPOC-led grassroots organizations, which especially include Indigenous-led organizations. And so in our coalitions, especially in our EJ coalitions, like I said, we try to be very cognizant of that and figure out not simply, equal distribution of these resources, but what is the equitable distribution of those resources? If we're talking about, following the lead of the voices of those most impacted, that was very roundabout. What does that actually mean, and how are we practicing it? I don't know that we always get it perfect or right, but
Yeah.
it is an intention.
Thank you. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks. Yeah, for Center for Community Wealth Building, as I mentioned, we focus on neighborhoods and in the metro area. We have relationships with Native organizations, and I'm trying to remember. I guess I should also share that as part of our work, every project has a steering committee that maximizes the voices of those who are most impacted. And so I'm trying to remember if we've had any. I guess we have had mestizo and Indigenous identified individuals, but it hasn't necessarily been a focus of only working with Native communities.
So the final question that I have is really, given your experience so far, what is one thing you can't wait to share with other communities about this work that will help inspire them to pursue or continue pursuing community ownership or stewardship? And Jessica, do you want to start us out?
Sorry, Paul, I was reading the question in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, this question in the chat just is adding a little bit more complexity to overall, but
yeah, let me just answer this real quick, because I think this is one of the key components. Shared learning and trust building, I would say that trust building has to come first. This is one of those areas where so many entities, especially coming through from a nonprofit background, unfortunately has made it more complex because so many individuals in our communities have been victims of either scams or just that being taken advantage of. And so that trust building piece was so incredibly important at the beginning because our communities are unfortunately used to nonprofits having funding and coming into our space. And the moment the funding ends, they're out. And so they want to make sure, our communities want to make sure that we're going to be here for the long haul. And so as part of that, I would go and visit businesses probably once a week and just canvas and talk to as many people as possible and be there. The other part of building trust with immigrant and BIPOC communities is showing up. I think about solidarity, and that to me means showing up even when I'm not needed or even when I don't need something. Our communities, unfortunately, only see individuals when something is expected of them. And so I wanted to create a different space in our communities where I could be there to support and provide my expertise, my voice, and truly build those relationships. I think about a lot of these business owners, not just as business owners, but actually my friends and the people that I truly care about. And so we're creating this space in a way that makes sense for them and for us.
Rabia, do you have any insight you'd like to share about that question about building trust and shared learning,
Yeah,
and countering the dominant worldview of individualism.
yeah, I mean, I really like what you said. And you know, I think a couple of things come to mind. So one is, you know, the shared learning and trust building also means that while we're coming with our own philosophy, right, around market forces and all of that, organizing with community and following the lead of those most impacted also means, you know, really listening to what their challenges are. And you know, being nimble enough to respond to those challenges and to work with them on what those innovative new ways of working might be, right? Even if it might feel challenging to me or to others, you know, that discomfort is what you work through to get to the next place. So I wanted to put that out there. I think the other piece, the part around solidarity, is really important. Our movements happen, our movements move forward because of solidarity, not because we're busy giving way and compromising on things that really don't connect our hearts and our heads. And a perfect example, at least here in LA, a year and a half ago in October 2022, there was a leaked audio recording of 3 council members, including the LA City Council president, that was full of racist, xenophobic, and anti-Indigenous slurs. There's no other way to put it. And there was a big outcry here in LA, especially from BLM LA, saying we will not allow business as usual to happen in City Hall until City Council does something, not just about these 3 people, but to also reverse the harms of votes that have happened that have been based on this. And one of our EJ coalitions that was like on the cusp of a final victory after 10 years of phasing out oil drilling in LA, we truly only had 2 votes left in City Council to do that. And we had City Council members who are saying, come on, let's do this, let's do this. And we instead voted to say that we are standing in solidarity with our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers in the city and saying, no, because solidarity is what will move us forward. And we will not sit back and allow this business as usual to continue, even if you're dangling this carrot of this victory. And that's the type of thing that moves us forward. So, yeah.
So thank you both. I want to recognize there's been really insightful things shared, and we unfortunately need to move on to the next part where we're going to have more of a conversation with the group. But thank you so much for your insight and for sharing your experience and your vision for what this movement could be. Maggie, do you want to take it away?
Yes, gosh, thank you so much. I could listen to you all talk about that. Let me share my screen here. And I think we can unpin Jessica from, or is it just me? Maybe it's gallery. Okay.
It's just you, yeah.
It's just me. So now we would like really acknowledging the lack of true deep community engagement and really rejecting the division tactics led by racist and capitalist forces. We want to practice the opposite of that. We want to be in community with you all, and really honoring one of our series session priorities is that we want the gathering to help you connect with others and deepen your shared learning and awareness of the field. And to enable that, we are going to move into smaller groups to allow for discussion. And what we're going to be asking you, or how we'd like you to structure your conversation, is really thinking about the past, what has brought you to this point in your pursuits. So how did you get started? What motivated your organization to explore community ownership and stewardship projects? And then think about the present moment. What do you need now to keep going? What opportunities do you see for advocacy, policy, and collaboration? And then lastly, as we mentioned, we're future thinking. We want to be thinking about our forward vision and really creating that, unlocking the power within community. We want to ask you, what is the vision for the future of your work? And how can we build a movement together to support community ownership and stewardship? I do want to also acknowledge that there's a Jamboard that you're welcome to engage with as well. And I think if I just stop screen share really quick, I can just walk you guys through this. Beautiful. So on this screen share, excuse me, let me go back to the first one. There's only 3 slides, so you should be able to find your way. There's sticky notes over in the corner here. You should be able to click on it and move it around. If you double click into it, you can share your content. If you need more sticky notes, they're over here in the side panel. So again, past, if you navigate at the top here to the second page, this is present. And again, we really want you all to be inputting here based on your conversations or based on your own individual input. So I think we've put the questions into the chat. For those of you who are requiring or desiring language interpretation and do not want to be put into a breakout room with all English speakers, please stay in the main room. And we will give you 15 minutes for this exercise, and we'll call you back. We'll give you about a minute to close out. I think Osman has been doing his magic behind the scenes and has set everybody up. So if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and shoot you into your breakout room so that you can start to have those conversations and fill out the Jamboard.
Maggie, I think you might need to share the access to Jamboard for folks to add their notes.